Hello, today we're going to talk about ecology, right? So community ecology is the name of this lecture. We're starting a new unit on ecology. We finished up our unit on evolution, although we will see that evolution is a theme that we'll continue to talk about as we keep going through the topics of the semester. And this lecture isn't just about community ecology. It's more of an introduction to ecology in general. And we'll see that although we can divide ecology up into different kinds, the idea of a community is underscores the whole concept of what ecology is all about. Ecology is the study of interactions of living things with each other and with the environment. And so two components are included in that. One is all of the other living things that are in the environment. So we'll call that the biotic component. And the other thing about ecology is that it extends beyond just say an individual organism or cell and goes into the environment. And so the physical and chemical aspects of where that organism lives. And so we say those are the abiotic characteristics. So we've got biotic versus abiotic, right? Physics and chemistry. Excuse me. Right, so we're going to cover quite a few topics today. This is a pretty long lecture, although the good news is there's only 3 lectures in this unit instead of 4, but they're all long. We're going to give a brief introduction to ecology, and then sort of one of the main ideas of what we think about as ecology is how do different kinds of organisms interact with one another. And we'll define all the possible kinds of interspecific interactions. So notice that there's an E in this word, interspecific. That means between. So we'll have 2 different species, say a cheetah and an antelope, or a sloth and a moth, right? 2 different kinds of species. How do they interact with one another? That's different than looking at intraspecific interactions. Right, intra means within. And so if we were looking, say, at mating behavior, we would want individuals mating with an individual of their own species. They're both of the same species. So those kinds of behaviors would be intraspecific. So cooperation, mating behavior, territorial behavior, those kinds of things are intraspecific interactions. And those can be part of ecology too. We're going to talk about another major theme of ecology, which is biodiversity. Biodiversity is a word that just means how diverse, how many different kinds of living things do we have. So remember we were talking about our definitions of species, that depending on how we define a species, our answer to that question might be different. And we're going to look at some different ways that we can evaluate biodiversity, some numerical measures. And also we're going to look at patterns of biodiversity around the planet. Why do we see more species some places than others? And what are some of the other predictable patterns that we can see? We're going to talk a little bit about loss of biodiversity, something that's currently happening, species extinctions. Next, we're going to look at biogeography. So that's a way of saying, where do we find species? And that is going to be based on their interspecific interactions, their interactions with the physical and chemical environment, and their ability to move around to get from one place to the other. So islands are a place where we have some really interesting biogeography to do, because we have a variety of factors that make those island habitats special. Finally, we're going to look at how humans are changing the environment. We're going to come back to this topic in the Earth lecture, but there's a couple different aspects of human-caused changes to the environment that we're going to touch on. And looking at them from slightly different perspectives is going to help us really understand the breadth and scope of those kinds of changes. So anthropogenic just means that human caused. All right, this figure captures the idea that even though we say ecology is the study of interactions between living things and each other and their environment, there's a whole bunch of different ways to be an ecologist, different kinds of questions that you might want to ask or be interested in. I'm an ecologist. I think ecology is nice. I think it is based on looking for patterns and how things are connected to one another. So it's a very systems perspective, and it is incredibly flexible. Almost any topic that you pick in science can have an ecology relation to it. So whether you want to study changes in DNA, that can help you inform what's happening from an ecological perspective, or whether you want to use satellite imagery to look at the planet from space. Those are sort of from the smallest scale to the biggest scale of tools or techniques that we might use in order to do ecology. So a lot of the time, though, ecologists are going to be people who are going out into the world, sampling, getting dirty, going to their field sites, and are really kind of outdoor sort of people. Although that's not necessarily true as much anymore, that there are more laboratory-based approaches, like I said, using DNA sequence, and also a lot more mathematical approaches to studying ecosystems that you might just end up sitting in front of your computer all day long, creating theoretical populations inside your computer, and then testing hypotheses about what can happen to them based on certain mathematical rules. And that's something I have done as part of my work. So the differences between these different approaches, organismal ecology is going to focus on a single target organism. Populations are groups of the same species, and we are going to look at how they change in size over time. And we'll come back to a whole lecture on that. Community ecology is looking at sort of a smaller geographic or regional area. So we might be studying salt marsh ecology. We might be studying chaparral ecology, the ecology of mountain streams or ponds. So we would sort of pick a specific habitat type, and we would look at the interactions that exist inside of it. Ecosystem ecology is a little bigger picture, and it's going to be looking more at, tending to look more at the physics and chemistry. Same thing with landscape ecology. A lot of landscape level work is looking at water and regional water flow and patterns, how nutrients move through the ecosystem. So at these higher levels, we're looking a little more abstractly at the physics and chemistry of how things are moving into and out of and through the ecosystem. All right, we're going to start with a little bit of an orientation to some vocabulary and some characteristics of the Earth. We're going to come back in more detail to the characteristics of the Earth in another lecture, but you need to have a basic idea of some of these characteristics in order to understand topics we're talking about today. All right, so the first important concept is latitude. Latitude is the way that we're going to say how close an environment is to the equator or how close it is to the poles. So the major climate zones that we see on the Earth, we call the tropics, closest to the equator. The temperate zones that are sort of warm, medium, and then the polar zones. So the polar zones are going to be much colder, more colder year round, And if you've ever watched any kind of nature shows, you have a general idea of the different regions. So tropical, temperate, and polar habitats are very different from one another. Organisms have very different adaptations, and there are predictable places where we can find these habitats on the planet. We'll come back to why and what the differences are a little later. So as we're looking at latitude, remember that the equator, the middle of the Earth, we're going to define its latitude as 0 degrees. And then just like on a protractor, when we get up to the poles, those are going to be 90 degrees of latitude. And we have to distinguish if we have 90 degrees north, that's the North Pole, 90 degrees south is the South Pole. So each of these habitat regions are about 30 degrees apart from one another. We see that the edge between temperate and tropic is 23.5 degrees, right? The latitude of San Diego is just about 33 degrees. So we're in the temperate zone, but we're kind of at the south end of it. The only parts of the United States that are tropical are Hawaii, and the southern tip of Florida actually qualifies as a habitat called subtropical. It's a little bit, it's in between temperate and tropical. All right, so moving away from the surface of the Earth, we have the atmosphere. And the atmosphere is a layer of gases that surrounds the Earth. And these gases, they float, but they're held onto the Earth by the force of gravity that the size of the planet determines, right? So these molecules are just floating around between the Earth and outer space. And as we get higher and higher in the atmosphere, the molecules are less dense, they're farther apart from one another. And also in general, as we get further away from the surface of the Earth, the temperature gets colder. There's a couple parts of the atmosphere that I want to make sure you understand. And we're dealing in biology with the stuff that's closest to the planet. So the layer of the atmosphere that's closest to the surface of the planet that goes up about 7 kilometers is called the troposphere. And the troposphere is where our weather is happening. And it contains mostly nitrogen gas, about 78%, oxygen gas, 20%, that's great, we need to breathe that. And then there's going to be small amounts of other molecules, water vapor. So remember that water can be in the gas state. And so there's actually quite a lot of water vapor in the troposphere. Carbon dioxide, it's less than 1%. And then other gases that we're going to refer to as greenhouse gases, such as nitrous oxide, methane, and different chlorofluorocarbons. So these greenhouse gases, the reason they're called that is because they act like a greenhouse for us. Now, they act like a greenhouse in that the glass on a greenhouse, the light of all the mixed colors of light can come and shine through the glass. And then when they strike things that are inside the greenhouse, say the dark colored flooring or the dark colored soil, the energy that's in that sunlight warms it up, right? So some of the light is reflected back as visible wavelength light, but some of the energy gets transformed into heat. And the heat that is getting reflected off of or re-radiating from warmed objects inside the greenhouse, as it rises, as heat does, when it gets to the glass is a good insulator for heat. So it doesn't transmit, or it doesn't allow that energy to pass through. Greenhouse gases in our troposphere act the same way. Sunlight can shine through them. The surface of the Earth gets warmed as infrared or heat is radiated back into the atmosphere. The greenhouse gases don't let it pass through. Right now, we like our greenhouse gas layer. The difference in the overall average temperature of the planet, if we didn't have any greenhouse gases, would be Right now, the Earth is an average temperature of about 15 degrees C. Without a layer of greenhouse gases, the average temperature of the Earth would be minus 18 degrees C, right, below zero. The average planet would be frozen. Right, so those greenhouse gases are good, right? They are good in general. They make our planet habitable. Right, but we will see later on in this lecture, we've started adding a lot more greenhouse gases, and that has the potential and is fact increasing the temperature, the average temperature of the planet, and having all kinds of other consequences too. So we'll come back to that, but just the fact that greenhouse gases exist and they are part of our troposphere in general is a good thing. All right, above the troposphere is the stratosphere. And that is where we find the ozone layer. So ozone is the O3 molecule. And the benefit of our ozone layer is that it reflects harmful UV radiation from sunlight. So, you know, if you've ever gone outside on a sunny day, especially if your skin color is light, or in the tropics where the sun intensity is higher, that the UV rays can cause not only sunburn, but they cause damage to DNA and other cellular structures. So if there was prolonged exposure to high levels of UV radiation, we'd see increased levels of all kinds of skin cancers and small organisms that didn't have any protection from it would have their DNA disrupted and they would die. So protection from the UV or ultraviolet radiation that comes in high levels from our sun, glorious sun, which we like very much. But that ozone layer that is in the stratosphere is very important to protect us from the UV radiation. Now, there are very tiny amounts of ozone also found in the troposphere. The concentration is extremely low compared to like the 90% of all the atmospheric ozone is found in the stratosphere. And so ozone in the troposphere, although it is a greenhouse gas, is so small in the amount that's there, and it's also extremely short-lived and highly variable. So when we're near some kind of production facility that makes ozone as a byproduct, we might find high ozone concentrations. But when that plant is shut off for the weekend, we'll find that the concentration of it decreases almost to nothing over a couple of days. So that's a brief introduction to regions of the Earth and important components of our atmosphere. The next topic that we want to cover is why is it important to know what the climate is? And we'll see that different organisms have certain physiological limits to circumstances that they are adapted to. So when we think about adaptation in the sense of evolution, we have characteristics of the organism that are matched to their environment. Right, so where we have a tropical environment, organisms need to not only be able to survive, but be happy in hot temperatures. Where we have a polar environment, organisms need to have adaptations like thick fur or fat layers so that they can stay warm enough in that very cold environment. All right, so for any species, we can draw what's called a distribution map or a range map. And that says, where do we find that organism? Where does it live? Some organisms have extremely limited geographic ranges. Others have basically global geographic ranges. And a lot of that depends on how far they are able to travel. So not only do we look at their habitat requirements, but their ability to do something called dispersal. Right? Dispersal is to move away from the place you started with. And we talked about it when we talked about sexual versus asexual reproduction. What happens to those offspring? Do they disperse? Do they go far away from the parent? That's good because then you don't compete with your own parents. But when we're looking at specific habitats, we may find that not all organisms are able to get there. right? Again, so we're talking about islands. They have a really interesting ecology because organisms need to be able to get there, right? So we don't find very many snakes on islands. What we do find is a lot of birds and bats, flying insects, those kinds of things, and a variety of organisms that are have a propensity to raft. That is, a tree falls down and it floats off, and there's some like little lizard sitting on it, and it can survive as it's floating across to another island. All right, so the other things we want to know about the organism's habitat are not just temperature and that it requires or that it's able to survive at, but also how much rainfall, the pattern of rainfall. Here in San Diego, we get all of our rainfall in the winter. There are other places that get a lot of rainfall in the summer. What is the soil like there? What kind of plants grow there, if an animal needs to eat those plants, etc. We're talking about marine habitats. We have some slightly different variables that we care about. So in marine or aquatic habitats, we're going to look at how much oxygen is in the water, what the salinity is, what the pH is, and organisms are going to have specific physiological limits or tolerances. So we'll find them in areas that are suited to their normal habitat, right? We don't find freshwater fishes out in the ocean. They would die. All right, so keeping this in mind that each individual species is going to have some limits on the places where we find it, let's start to look at what kind of interspecific interactions organisms can have. All right, so we're going to have these interspecific interactions, and that is going to mean that we have two species that are interacting with one another, and they're different species. So I have a little table here that's listing all the different kinds of interactions. And then the two columns show, well, we've got one of the species, right? And then we've got the other species, all right? Some of these interactions, we have a name for one of the species and the other species, all right? So for the interspecific interaction called predation, one of the species is the predator and the other species is the prey. All right, so we have wolf and we have deer, or we have, any of those examples that you are familiar with. All right, so another interspecific interaction is competition. So competition among organisms, just like between businesses, is when they're both trying to go for the same resources, right? When you have two phone companies in the area, they want to get as many clients as they can in that area. If you go to one cell phone service, that is money gained by one service, but it's money lost by the other one, right? So in competition between organisms, they're trying to use the same resource. So if you imagine one of those water holes in Africa and all of the animals are trying to come and drink from the water, if an elephant goes in there and it sucks up all the water, the other animals don't get any, right? So in that case, they would be competing for that resource, right? Symbiosis is a word that's sometimes confused with mutualism. Mutualism is one example of a symbiosis, and a symbiosis is just a definition for an interspecific interaction where the two organisms are physically close to one another or touching. And there are a couple different kinds. Parasitism, where we have a parasite that lives in or on the body of its host. We often think of disease-causing organisms. We call them by the name pathogen, but they're essentially parasites as well. If you were infected by Streptococcus bacteria, it's a parasite on you. It's living in or on you, and you are the host. Another interaction between species is herbivory, and that's where we have an herbivore, an animal that eats plants, and then the plant that it eats. In mutualism, you probably know a ton of examples of this already because this is fun to talk about, and nature shows love to share these examples. So mutualism is a relationship where the species help one another. They both get a benefit. All right, so I'm going to start filling in on this table something else about these relationships, and that is who gets harmed and who gets benefited. And we'll see that all the possible combinations of harm and benefit exist between these 5 different defined kinds of interactions. That's why we don't have 7 kinds of interactions or 3 kinds of interactions. We have defined this list because they represent all the possible combinations of benefit, harm, or neutral. Right. So mutualism, mutualism is where both species benefit. All right. Whatever species A is, it's an ant. Species B is an acacia plant. The acacia secretes some little drops of nectar. The ants feed on that. They get fed by the plant. The benefit that the plant gets is that the ants protect it. They'll attack other insects that are coming to act as herbivores on it. Commensalism is one that is a little trickier to understand sometimes. And that means there's an organism that's simply sitting on or in the body of another organism, but the host doesn't even really notice it. It's really small. It's not sucking any resources out of the body like a parasite would. It's kind of just hanging on for the ride. The host doesn't even notice it, right? So the commensal gets a benefit from being there, whereas the host is neutral, so null. It has neither a detriment or a benefit. All right, let's go back and define the pluses and minuses of these other interactions. One of the easy ones is predator and prey. Right, the predator gets a meal. The prey gets dead. So that's a negative. And something that's important about the predator-prey interaction is that for the prey, there isn't a slightly being predated upon. Predation is defined as killing the prey, right? So it's really bad. It's as bad as it can get, right? So we've got a plus plus, we've got a plus 0, we've got a plus minus, right? What else do we have? Well, there's a minus minus. So we have interactions where both species are harmed, right? So competition is defined as that type of interaction. Remember, we said that both organisms are trying to use the same resource. Some of this organism gets some of it, some of this organism gets some of it, but neither one gets the whole thing, right? So because those 2 species are trying to use the same resource, they're both harmed, right? What do companies want to be? Companies want to be monopolies. They don't want to have any competition, right? So that would be the best place to be. So we'll see that organisms actually actively try and avoid competition, and we'll look at some of the ways that they do that. Right, so for parasite, pathogen, and herbivore, these are both interactions where the disease-causing organism or parasite, where the herbivore gets a benefit, and the host of the plant doesn't die, right? They have a negative, but it's a small loss. Right, so just because a mosquito has bitten you doesn't mean you're going to die unless it gives you malaria, right? It's going to take a little bit of blood. If 10,000 mosquitoes got you all at once, maybe you would die. But in general, herbivores don't eat all of the plant that they're chewing on either. The koala doesn't strip the entire eucalyptus tree, right? They're going to be nibbling at a few leaves, letting the plant live so that it can continue making more. So it's sort of a difference in the amount of negative, right? Sometimes I write down negative, negative, negative for prey and only 1 negative sign for the host of a parasite, all right? Does that make sense? All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about each of these interspecific interactions. If you don't have an example you can think of that comes right to your mind. We'll go through a few. But I also challenge you to come up with your own examples that you are familiar with already, because these are the kinds of things that are really frequently talked about in nature shows, and they're fun. All right, so competition. Organisms are going to try and avoid it. And so when we actually go out into nature, competition is really tricky and interesting to study because we usually don't see it happening, right? We don't see it happening. So when we're talking about competition, an important vocabulary word is niche or niche. And a niche is defined as basically the space in the environment that the species needs or that it takes up. So if you imagine all of the resources that a species needs during its lifetime, then its niche as defined as all of those things. Those might be food sources, water sources, places to warm up in the morning, places to stay cool in the summer, places to find a mate, and any other resources that an organism might need. I'm thinking of some birds and monkeys. They eat clay, soil, because it actually helps decontaminate some of the toxins from plants that they need. So some kind of minerals might be included in that. All right, so a group of organisms that has been highly studied, fascinating group of organisms are the anole lizards from the genus Anolis, and they occur in the islands of the Caribbean. And so what ecologists noticed when they were starting to study them was that each or along several different Caribbean islands, there were different species of anoles, but that they had sort of filled into these different niches, and they did it in the same way. So on one Caribbean island, there would be 4 species of these lizards, and one would live in the trees, one would live on fences, one would live in the shrubs, and one would live on the ground. And then they went over to the next island and they found 4 different species of animals, but that they had these specialty areas, these habitats that they focused on. Right. And so this led to the idea of habitat partitioning, right? So over evolutionary time, these species have evolved to avoid competition by keeping into their own niches or separating their niches from one another so that each one uses specific resources. They aren't overlapping in the environment, okay? So resource or habitat partitioning, right? When you put up a partition between 2 rooms, it separates them, right? So separating out the parts that they use. So this is something that happens over evolutionary time. We see species that have specialized compared to one another to avoid competition, right? So when we go and we look at these lizards, we don't see competition happening because they have avoided it. All right, another thing that can happen that we can notice is that in real time, we can have organisms that are competing with one another, but those patterns are still hard to see. So when we go out into the environment, we might see that certain species are living in one habitat and that other species are living in a different habitat. And we might at first think, oh, well, that's where they want to live. Those are their niches, and they don't overlap with one another. All right, but what turns out happening is that any organisms that have exactly the same niche in the environment, it turns out that kind of like natural selection in general, where we have one phenotype or genotype that does a little better than the other ones, is going to tend to accumulate and exclude them, right? In the environment, each species is going to have a niche that it's a little better at using than other species, and that in that particular niche, it's going to prevent that species from existing, right? So this phenomenon is called competitive exclusion. right? And because of competition, one of the species is able to exclude or push out the other one. And this was first demonstrated in the rocky intertidal zone of the marine habitat. So if you're at the edge of the sea, like down in La Jolla or in Sunset Cliffs, you can see that there's these rocks there. And then as the tide goes up and down, we have high tide levels that aren't covered by the water as much. And we have lower tide levels that are covered by the water more during the day. And so scientists noticed that there was a species of barnacle called Thamellus that lived on the high tide edge of the rocks, and the Balanus barnacle that lived on the low tide edge of the rocks. And they were curious to see, could each of the species live in the other species area, right? So they scraped off all the barnacles on these rocks and they waited to see what would happen. So it turns out that each of the species, both Balanus and Thamellus, can live up across the whole range, right? So if we looked at, okay, suppose Thamellus wasn't there, where would we find Balanus? We would find it all the way up to the high tide line, right? So on this slide, we have this concept of realized niche, right? And that is making a distinction between where you can live and where you end up living. The realized niche is where you end up living as a result of some competition or other interspecific interactions. Where you could live if you didn't have competitors is called the fundamental niche. And it's really sort of what we'd think of as the whole niche, the whole space in the environment, right? But the realized niche is where you only where you can live based on competitors. All right, so it turns out that Thamellus is actually a little better at living at the higher tide zone, and Balanus is a little better at living at the lower tide zone, and they're able to exclude one another, right? They actually, as they're growing as little juveniles, they grow faster in their realized niche, and they actually can scrape or push off the individuals of the other species because they're growing faster, right? So here is an example of something where we go out and we look at the environment and we see a pattern, but there's a lot more to it than what we're actually seeing. So the purpose of experiments is to change what that looks like, and then observe what happens after you've made that intervention. So this is a really a nice historical kind of example of a foundational experiment in ecology that showed a principle that has turned out to apply to a lot of other organisms. And we can actually see this happen in the lab if we have a tank or a beaker with a culture of bacteria or with a culture of algae or with small pond organisms. And we put two different species in there. Almost always we'll see that one of them actually persists indefinitely while the other one goes extinct. So we can make competitive exclusion happen in the laboratory as well. All right, another tricky thing organisms can do in order to avoid competition is something called character displacement. All right, and our example is from Galapagos Island finches. And we see two species of Galapagos Island finches here. We have Geospiza fuliginosa and Geospiza fortis, some ground finches. Notice the size of their beaks are a little different. One's bigger, one's smaller. We have a situation with these finches where on some islands in the Galapagos, only one of them lives. And then on other islands, both of them exist, right? So on the island where they both exist, remember we have sympatric speciation versus allopatric speciation. Sympatric means shared country or shared land, right? So the sympatric populations are ones that are sharing the same geographic space. Allopatric is when they're alone. All right, notice the size of the beaks, the beak depths. We've got the orange species on the left, the green species on the right. And what happens when they're the only finch on the island is that they have this sort of intermediate beak depth. But when we find them co-occurring and then competing with one another, we find them with displacement or shift, right? They have had directional selection so that their beak depth have moved apart from one another, right? That means they're going to be feeding on different sized seeds, right? Now, these are populations, these aren't the whole species. So this example of character displacement is an example where we can see evolution happening. We don't get new species like we got in the lizard example. And they don't competitively exclude one another, right? So if we never had any islands where those two species occurred, then that would tell us that they were able to competitively exclude one another. What has happened is, what can happen in populations is that they can have small shifts or they can have characteristics that are somewhat different from one another. So our populations on Daphne and on Santa Maria of our Geospiza fortis have slightly different beak depth from one another. They're still the same species, but they have an adaptation to that specific island based on whether another bird species lives there or not, right? So these are three different ways that organisms are going to be trying to avoid competition. They're either going to sort of live in only part of their normally available habitat. They're going to have a population shift, right? So evolution, kind of little e evolution. They don't turn into a new species, but they have a slightly different version of their characteristic and only where they co-occur with their competitor, or they can diverge enough to become completely different species that use the habitat differently so that they aren't competing, right? They're just going to stop being a phone company and start, dog walking, whatever. All right, so switching gears from competition to predation. All right, the idea of predation is pretty easy to wrap your head around. You've got a lion or a cheetah and it's going to eat an antelope or a zebra. All kinds of interesting things happen though with predators versus prey, right? So they are going to be exerting, and in fact, all of our interspecific interactions are going to be exerting forces on one another. And when we have two different species exerting forces of selection on one another, we say that co-evolution is happening. These two species are evolving together. And in fact, kind of like sexual selection where males and females are exerting selection on one another, these two species are actually helping to shape the characteristics of the other. All right, so predators and prey, like Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner, are locked in eternal struggles where each one is trying to get better and better. The prey is trying to get better and better at escaping the predators, and the predators are trying to get better and better at getting the prey. Right? Remember, they don't get to design themselves, they don't get to choose characteristics, but if there is a mutation that causes a characteristic to help them do that better, then it will get passed on and it will get increased, right? So they have to have a mutation first, but then if it's beneficial, it will get eventually through the whole population. So if we look at cheetahs, for example, their bodies differ from other big cats. They're longer and thinner, their spine is more flexible, their tail is longer. Those are things that allow them to run really fast, right? So that has been a direction that selection has pushed them to allow them to be successful, right? So each of those big cats, the cheetah, the lion, the leopard, they're successful at being a predator. They do it in slightly different ways. And what does that do? That reduces competition between them, right? But they don't like one another. Lions will try and kill cheetahs whenever they get a chance, right? All right, so the prey, they might be able to run faster or have some kind of behavior that helps them elude predation. We see things in their offspring are born ready to run, which is different than say, wolf pups, they don't even leave the den for a long time, right? So we have all these different adaptations, right? So this idea that the predator and the prey can continue to have adaptations that make one better and then the other one better and so on and so forth is called an evolutionary arms race. So when we think about an arms race in human terms, we think, well, one country builds a nuclear weapon and they say, haha, we have a nuclear weapon. And then the other country builds 3, and then the other country builds 5, and then the other country, makes them even bigger. And then the other country, so there's sort of this continued escalation of the defenses, right? Or weapons, however you want to think of them. All right. So what we tend to see happening is this ratcheting of these characteristics. And so we see some kind of really extreme adaptations because predator and prey have been trying to outwit each other for thousands of years. So for example, we have a pronghorn antelope here in the plains in the United States, and it can actually run faster, way faster than any predator that's here today. But there's an extinct cheetah, a North American cheetah that lived during the Pleistocene. And so the pronghorn antelopes had that animal as their predator, and they evolved to be really fast to be able to run away from it. Right? So they have extra speed they don't need anymore because the cheetah went extinct. My favorite example of an evolutionary arms race is a salamander that lives in the Pacific Northwest and the northern Oregon and California mountains. And there's a garter snake that eats it. So the salamander at some point evolved a toxin, a molecule that it could exude in its mucus that the snake would be discouraged from eating it or even poisoned by. But the snake had a mutation that allowed it to digest the toxin without being harmed, right? So then the salamander evolved a slightly stronger toxin, right? And then the snake evolved to be able to detoxify the stronger toxin, right? And so this thing has been happening for so long that this newt is so toxic, like literally, if you licked it, you would die. And it seems like it's way, way, way more toxic than it should conceivably need to be. But then there's this snake out there that can still eat it anyway, right? So that's an example of an evolutionary arms race. All right, so when organisms are trying to avoid predation, there's 2 strategies that they can use. Camouflage, which is blending in with the background, and mimicry, which is looking like somebody else, right? Why would we want to look like somebody else? Well, the somebody else has something that's going to help it defend itself from the predator. We don't have that thing, but we want to look like it, right? So monarch butterflies, shown on the left and the top, common butterfly in our area. They eat a milkweed plant as caterpillars, and they absorb the toxic molecules that those the plant has, and so the adult butterfly is toxic. Well, we have these other butterflies, viceroys. There's a handful of other species as well that look like the monarch. Well, what's the benefit of looking like the monarch? You can fool the predators thinking it's the toxic one, and they will eat you less. All right. Other examples are snakes that are poisonous versus non-poisonous, all kinds of examples of mimicry. Camouflage is just trying to blend in with the background so that your predator or even your prey. So there's predators that have camouflage as well. And so they may just sit there and wait for a prey item. The camouflage of this stick insect in this photo on the lower left is so good. I was looking at this picture and I was like, what's in that? Like, it's leaves. What is in there? It's so well camouflaged that you don't even see it. It's kind of a blurry picture, but anyway. So we have all kinds of organisms that have a pattern or color that match the environment. There's all kinds of crazy ones. There's caterpillars that look like lizard poops. There's I don't know, you probably know examples of this as well. There's all kinds of crazy caterpillars. They have big eye spots on their rear end that look like a snake or something. so that the, a bird that might be trying to sneak up on them doesn't realize that they're a caterpillar. All right, so there's all kinds of other anti-predator adaptations, things that are sticking out or whatever, but I just want you to understand the idea. All right, so our next group of topics is those symbiosis. So remember, symbiosis means that the two species are closely associated, that the parasite or pathogen is living in or on the host. For those of you who want to be vets, there's plenty of common parasites in dogs. There's external parasites like fleas and ticks. There's internal parasites like heartworms and hookworms, giardia. So those, depending on the how many there are and what harm they cause, can be life-threatening in dogs. So humans tend to get these kinds of parasites more in tropical climates than they do in temperate climates. So if you're practicing medicine in tropical climates, or you have patients who are immigrants or have traveled there, you might see more parasites as health issues. Usually parasites don't kill the organism, but there may be a sort of a low level of poor health or inability to resist other diseases if you have a high parasite load in the body. All right, mutualisms. Mutualisms are fun. They are things that benefit both organisms. And my favorite example has to do with sloths, which are critters that I really like. So the sloth is hanging there in the tree, and it has at least two mutualistic organisms. There is an algae that grows in the sloth's fur, and there's a moth that hangs out around the sloth. Right, so there's sloth moths, which is just cool that it exists. And so there's a benefit to the sloth in both of these cases. There's a benefit to the algae in each of the cases, and a benefit to the moth, right? So the moths kind of live in the fur. They hang out in a cloud around the sloths. And then when the sloth goes down to the bottom of the tree every once in a while, which it does, to poop, the moths lay their eggs on the sloth poop, right? So they hang around the sloth so they know where the poop is. And then the moths actually help provide nutrients in the fur that the algae needs to grow, right? So the sloth actually licks some of the algae off of its fur. It gets some nutrients, but the other thing it does is when the sloth is living up in the tree and it's in amongst all these green leaves, there's a little benefit of camouflage where the sloth is looking green as well as the leaves around it. So anyway, there's all kinds of cool examples of mutualisms. All right, commensalisms, they're a little less common. They're a little harder to see happening. You might not think about it as a relationship, but some examples are, we see a lot in tropical forests. We've got plants sitting on top of other kinds of plants. And those plants are called epiphytes. Epi means on top of. And so we have one species sitting on top of the other. Now that tree, that little bromelia is sitting on, it doesn't even know it's there. It isn't bothering it. But the bromelia gets more light because it's being held up higher in the canopy, and it also may get the benefit of some water trickling down the trunk of the tree, some nutrients. There's, monkeys and stuff up there that are pooping and whatnot. So it gets a benefit and the host tree is not harmed. In the marine environment, we have a lot of really cool examples on coral reefs where we have organisms that sort of make hidey holes. They live in other organisms. So this is a little shrimp that's living inside of a sponge. So the body of the sponge has a hollow shape. Sponge is just sitting there. The shrimp isn't helping it, it isn't harming it, isn't eating it, it's just using it as a house. Another example, birds may hang out around large grazers, and the buffalo couldn't care less that egret is there, but the grasshoppers that are hopping up while the buffalo is scuffling its big feet around, the egret is getting a good meal from following the buffalo around. Another example is these barnacles that live on the whales. They don't seem to have any negative effect on the whales. The barnacle gets a free ride, it gets access to lots of food, it doesn't have any predators, so it gets to see the world. It has lots of benefits. So this is deer with the spider web and its antlers. I don't know if that's a thing that happens very often, but it was a crazy picture, and that spider definitely is getting its web moved around through a large range of potential insect food. All right, so keep your eye out for commensalisms now that you know about them. And so those are our different interspecific interactions. And now we're going to move on to looking at, okay, what are some other ways that we can talk about species in their community? All right. So it turns out that some species are more important than others in the community. For example, sea otters. All right, sea otters are these adorable marine mammals. They swim around grabbing different invertebrates as prey. They eat crabs, they eat sea urchins. All right, so sea otters are a predator. And when we hunted sea otters nearly to extinction, it turns out that without the sea otters as predators, the urchins populations increased. And what happened is the urchins were crawling around in these areas where these large underwater organisms live, these giant kelps. So we had kelp forests like we have off the coast of Southern California. But when we didn't have sea otters, these sea urchins increased into numbers such that, and as they're going along and grazing, what they do is they eat off the bottoms of these giant kelps. The kelps float away. And when we do have a kelp forest, right, it's like a land forest. It has a lot of vertical structure. You see fishes swimming through it. There's all kinds of little invertebrates that live in between the blades on the kelp. In amongst the rocks and things in the bottom, there's all kinds of other organisms living. So there's literally hundreds of species that are there in that environment as long as the kelp forest is there, but you remove the kelp forest or the sea otters destroy it and you lose those thousands of species, right? So the concept of the sea otters in this scenario is that the sea otters provide a critical service. If we take the sea otters away, the whole community collapses, right? So we call this kind of species a keystone, right? The keystone, there's actually a thing called a keystone. And if you're building an archway out of bricks, oops. You get up to the very top stone, and once you wedge it in there, it holds all the other ones up, right? Before you put that keystone in there, you have to hold up the bricks making up the arch using scaffolding or your friends, right? But once you slide that keystone in there, it exerts a force on the other ones, it holds them in. All right, the idea of a keystone species is that it's a species that if you take it away, if you remove it, the entire community collapses, right? So if we want to talk about it in terms of biodiversity, the total number of species, where we have that species, we have high biodiversity. Where we don't have that species, we have low biodiversity, right? So these keystone species kind of hold up the rest of the community. Often they're predators. They aren't always predators. So we have apex predators like the sea otter. Also wolf and starfish are also keystone species in their habitats because they help promote overall diversity. But we can also have keystone species that have other functions. So if we're talking about a plant community, we might have pollinators that are a keystone species that without them, none of the plants could be there. And the beaver is a nice example. So beaver is a North American mammal. They are the engineers of the ecosystem. What they do is they cut down trees and they actually build dams and they make ponds and they retain water in the ecosystem. They can actually turn fairly dry habitats that don't have water present year round. Through their engineering behavior, they can turn them into rich and diverse ecosystems. Right. So the ecosystem engineers, elephants can also be viewed as ecosystem engineers. Basically, they go crashing around and they break stuff and they knock it over and they open up habitat for other species to come in. So that's another example. There's one other kind of really important species. So keystone species is one way of being a really important species. Another way of being a really important species is as a foundation, right? So a building is built on its foundation. It's like a really hard, flat spot so that the house, once you start to build it, it doesn't settle, it doesn't fall over, it, it has a nice stability to it. So foundational species are things that actually support the entire ecosystem because they're sort of on the bottom of it, literally. So coral in coral reefs, they build the entire structure of it. So they're considered a foundational species. It's a coral reef. It isn't there without the corals. In a forest, the trees are considered foundational species. They weren't there, the forest wouldn't exist. It's a slightly different idea than a keystone species. And it's another way of saying that there's organisms that are important in that community, more important than other ones, right? If you take the coral away, there's no coral reef. If you take, parrotfish away, there's still a coral reef. All right. Our next topic is ways we can talk about the overall structure of the community. So we can say it has a particularly important species, or we can talk about who eats who. So talking about the structure of the community, how species interact with one another. We've already talked about this a very tiny bit. You've probably learned this in elementary school. We're going to get into a little more detail about it in this class. If we just look at who eats who, our food chain is sort of a series of steps of who eats who. In the terrestrial environment or on land, we're going to have plants as the basis of that. Plants are called producers, primary producers specifically, because they take energy from sunlight and they produce biomass, right? Biomass is basically a word for the amount of living stuff that there is, right? So if you pull up a sunflower from your garden and you weigh it, that's the biomass of that sunflower. Where did that mass come from? Well, it came from energy and sunlight, carbons from carbon dioxide, and nutrients that were in the soil. All right, so we made a living thing out of non-living things. All right, so plants are called producers because they make biomass in the first place from abiotic chemicals. All right, so the plant's eaten by an herbivore. So an herbivore is an animal that eats plants, but we can also call it a consumer. And it's a primary consumer because it's eating the plant. Then we have a carnivore, or an animal that eats other animals. And because it eats an animal that ate a plant, we're going to call it a secondary consumer. We keep going up this chain here, and we get to sort of the apex predators or the top consumers in the environment. All right, so if they ate an animal that ate an animal that ate an animal that ate an animal, then that one ate a plant, they're at this highest level. All right, we we never really see higher than fourth level consumers, and we'll come back to why in a couple lectures. So when we look around the world in the terrestrial environment, we see tons of plants everywhere, right? So obviously the herbivores are only eating little tiny bits of them. When we look in the marine habitat, we actually have this phytoplankton is the basis of the food web, unless we're looking at, say, a kelp forest environment. But out of the whole ocean, those are a teeny fraction of a percent, right? So these single-celled algae and other eukaryotes that we looked at in the eukaryotes versus prokaryotes lab, examples like diatoms and dinoflagellates, these are the phytoplankton, and they are the basis of the food chain in marine environments. So they're teeny, so you can't have a very big animal that eats them. They're just too small. So we have very little animals that eat them, and they are called zooplankton, right? Phytoplankton are the primary producers, zooplankton, zoo for animal, are the primary consumers, right? So little tiny fish eat the little tiny zooplankton, larger fish eat the small fish, and even larger fish and marine mammals eat those larger fish, right? There's occasional exceptions like baleen whales, that eat the zooplankton. But the main idea is that we have this series of who eats who going up through the ecosystem, and the arrows are pointing up because that's where the energy is going, right? So we have a flow of energy and also nutrients that's going from the primary producers through the consumers. Now, this isn't very realistic, just looking at a chain of one thing eats another thing. In fact, most ecosystems have a complicated set of interconnecting trophic interactions that's better described as a food web. All right, here's a very simple example that doesn't even include everything from Antarctica. So as you can see in the real world, what we actually have is, phytoplankton still there at the bottom. We have multiple kinds of primary consumers. It isn't just one kind, right? We've got krill and we've got copepods that are eating it. Then for our krill, say, right, our krill are eaten by a bunch of different predators. So there isn't just one food item and one consumer. When we look at these different organisms, sometimes they're eating things from multiple levels. We could have a tertiary consumer. Sometimes it eats secondary consumers, sometimes it eats primary consumers. It's flexible, right? And that so we have organisms are getting eaten by more than one thing, organisms are eating more than one thing, and then we have the levels don't really line up. Fish larvae, juvenile fish, are part of the plankton, right? So at different life stages, we'll see that things may be different levels of the food web as well, right? So a really important idea in ecology, in ecosystems, in food webs, in systems thinking in general, is that where we have these complicated interrelationships between species, they're all connected to one another, right? And so if we sort of, opened a brand new harvest, a fishery for squid, and we started taking, thousands of tons of squid out of this ecosystem a year, it would have an impact. It would tug hardest on the closest connections that it has in the food web. But because everything is connected, it would have reverberations, all right? It would impact multiple species in multiple ways. The bigger and more complicated our food web is, the easier, the better it is able to resist changes and to recover from changes, right? So one of the reasons that, as we talk about biodiversity in a few minutes, is where we consider high biodiversity a good thing. Where we have high biodiversity, we have complicated interactions between multiple species. We consider that a healthy, functioning ecosystem, and also one that's going to be able to resist collapsing if there's a change in it, right? All right, our next topic is biodiversity. So let's get a quick definition of what biodiversity is. It's simply the idea of how much variation is there among the living things that we're considering. We can look at genetic diversity. We know that genetic diversity is generally a good thing, and that we can look at genetic diversity in terms of different kinds of genetics, the total number of alleles that are present in a population, the total proportion of heterozygotes compared to homozygotes. That's another measure of biodiversity at the genetic level. In small populations and endangered species, we're worried about their genetic diversity, but usually in large populations, we're not. In general, the way we think about biodiversity is at the sort of community or ecosystem level. So we might be walking through a particular habitat and we're noticing, oh, I'm seeing different kinds of plants, I'm seeing different kinds of animals. And if you make a list of all of those species that you see or that you more systematically survey for, then you'd be counting up the number of species. Or if you're, a mammalogist, you would be counting up the numbers of mammals. If you're a slug biologist, you'd be counting up the number of different species of slugs, or a mycologist counting the fungi. So we're going to use this as a really simple indicator of biodiversity. It's called species richness. It's capital R, and it's simply a count of the number of species, right? Species richness is high, you've got a lot, it's good, it's more. If it's low, then it's less, right? So when we look at birds, for example, when we look at a particular ecosystem in the San Diego region, right, we would be looking at this level. We might go to a beach and we count the shorebirds that were there and the gulls. If we went to chaparral area, like around campus, we count the birds that live there. And if we went into the mountains and the forest, we would see different kinds of birds, and we could count up the number of species that live there. And there's going to be some that live across all those habitats, like crows. But as we go across the whole landscape, right? So if we look at the bottom slide, we look at the landscape or the whole region, as we go across San Diego County, the amount of biodiversity increases as we increase those ecosystems or types of plant communities that we go through. So San Diego County is actually an incredibly diverse region, partly because it's large, partly because it stretches from the ocean to the desert and also has mountains, so it has lots of different ecotypes, partly because our climate is fairly moderate, very pleasant. Not only do people like to live here, lots of kinds of organisms do. So there have been 500 different kinds of birds that have been recorded in San Diego County, and that's more than a lot of countries, right? So it's a great place to live if you're interested in nature and the outdoors and hiking and whatnot. All right, so suppose we want to do something a little more sophisticated than just count up the number of species. There's lots of different ways we can measure biodiversity. So people have come up with a lot of different metrics trying to capture more sophisticated ways of looking at biodiversity. So besides species richness, which is just a count of how many species there are, right? So if we go to these different habitats and look at the trees, we have community 1 on the left-hand side. It's got 4 kinds of trees, A, B, C, D, right? So its species richness, capital R, would equal 4. We look at the other community on the right-hand side, and we walk through it and we find, okay, it's got the same 4 species, right? So we would say its species richness, capital R, equals 4 as well, right? But look at the amount of each of the trees. We have in the left-hand community 1, we have an equal distribution. We have the same number. There's 20 trees there. We see that there's 5 of each of the species, right? And we look at community 2 and we see that that lollipop fluffy green tree, there's most of the trees are that kind, right? So we have a dominant species. We have one that there's more individuals of, right? So this idea, those 2 communities have the same species richness, but they have different evenness, right? Evenness is how evenly our individuals are distributed between the species, right? So our community 1 on the left is perfectly evenly distributed, whereas our community on the right is unevenly distributed. Right? If we were calculating a metric of evenness, higher values would be good. They would represent better evenness. And we consider a more even community a more diverse community, right? A more even community is considered a more biodiverse community. All right, so there's a metric called the Shannon Index that we're going to call capital H that includes both species richness and evenness in the measure that it calculates. So I'm going to show you. I'm going to go to the next slide briefly, and then I'm going to show you how to calculate the Shannon Index. So what you should do is you should come back to this slide, look at these percentages, and I'm going to tell you what the Shannon indices are, but you should see if you can calculate it yourself, right? I'm going to work through that when we meet in person, but after I do the next example, I want you to try calculating it for this example and see if you come up with H equals 1.38 for community 1 and H equals 0.709, right, for community 2. All right, so looking at these numbers, we see that the H is higher for community 1. That tells us biodiversity is higher. And so higher Shannon Index means higher biodiversity. It doesn't have more species, but it has more evenness, right? I'm going to look at another example that is 2 different populations of different, communities of different turtles. We have community A that has 4 kinds and community B that has 3 kinds. And they've got 5 individuals of each kind. All right, so I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to turn my camera down and work through this. Equation for our Shannon Index H is that we're going to take the opposite of the sum from little I equals 1. That is going to be starting with the first species to little s, where little s is the number of species. Right, so for however many species we have, we're going to start with the first one and go through all of them. And what we're going to calculate is our proportion of the ith species, right? And we're going to multiply that times the natural log of the proportion of the ith species, right? So in our turtle example, we have, I'm going to call it community A. We have species 1, we have 5 of them. Species 2, we also have 5. Species 3, we have 5, and species 4, we also have 5. Right, whereas in community B, we have species 1 of 5 of them, species 2, we have 5 of them, and species 3, we also have 5 of them. We don't have any of species 4. Right, so our species richness in community A, our capital R equals 4. You have any individuals of species 4 down here. Right, so our capital R equals 3. Right. So just by that measure, we could say, aha, one of these is more diverse than the other. All right. And so we're going to see how that plays out in calculating our Shannon Index. Right. In our other example, we had the same number of species. We had the same species richness, but we had different evenness. Okay, so the first thing we need to know is what is our total number of individuals in each of our samples. And we're going to add apples and oranges. We're going to say how many individuals of any species do I have? I have 20 from my community A and I have 15 from community B. All right, so I'm going to find my little p sub i's, right? The proportion of individuals out of the whole community, right? So the math here is really easy. Figuring out what the heck this little p sub I means is a little trickier, but we're just going to take the number of individuals, right? So little I, we're going to go through all of the little i's that we have. Species 1 is little I1, species 2 is little I2, little I3, and little I4. So starting with p sub 1, right? So my little p sub 1 is going to equal 5 divided by 20. My little p sub 2 is also going to equal 5 divided by 20. My little p sub 3 is also 5 divided by 20. And my little p sub 4 is 5 divided by 20. Right? You getting the hang of this? All right. So my little p sub I for my community B, I'm going to do one of them. They're all going to be equal to one another. And they're going to be 5 divided by 15. Right, so we're going to divide by that capital N. All right, so my little p sub I up here, they all equal 2, 5. My little p sub I down here all equal 0.33. So if our little p sub i's were different from one another, we would take each one and multiply it times its natural log, and we'd add all those up, right? So all 4 of our little p sub i's are the same, right? So instead of writing them all out and then adding them up, I'm going to say I've got 4 of these, they're all the same. So my capital H is going to equal -4 times my 0.25 times the natural log 0.25. All right, so you need to have this natural log function on your calculator. All these values, these natural logs, are going to come out to be negative numbers. So the reason we have this take the opposite of at the beginning of our equation is because we want our capital H values to come out positive, so bigger ones can be higher biodiversity. It just makes more sense that way, right? So we're going to do -4 times 0.25 times my natural log of 0.25 comes out to be -1.39. All right, and this negative cancels out this negative, so I get a positive value for my capital H of 1.38. I do the same thing for my other community. My capital H is going to, now I've got 3 of these instead of 4, so I'm going to do -3 times 0.33 times the natural log of 0.33. That means my H is equal to -3 times 0.33 times, again, I have a -1.19. And that gives me 1.19, right? Looking at these 2 communities, they had equal evenness. One of them had more species richness than the other, right? The one with the 4 species came out to have a higher Shannon index, 1.38 compared with 1.09, right? All I'm going to ask you to do is calculate the Shannon index, have 2 communities to compare, whichever one has the higher Shannon index has the higher biodiversity, right? That's simple. Same thing with species richness. Count up the number of species, whichever one is higher has the higher biodiversity, right? The math here isn't too tricky. We've got a natural log, but we've got just like multiplying and adding. So there's dozens of different diversity indices. People are super interested in measuring biodiversity, trying to figure out good ways of doing it. So there's a whole bunch of different kinds of these biodiversity indices, right? And Shannon is just an example one. I like to make you do math, so we tried that one out. All right, so once we have a way to measure biodiversity, we want to look at how is it distributed around the planet? Is it the same everywhere? The answer to that is No, right? So there's some patterns that we can observe in how biodiversity is distributed. That is, what places have high biodiversity, even if there is no negative human impacts on them, right? So before humans even evolved on this earth, there were areas with high biodiversity compared to areas with low biodiversity. So what are some of those patterns? Right, one of the most obvious and strong patterns is that biodiversity changes over latitude. So remember, latitude is 0 at the poles and it's 90 degrees at the equator. So if you look at this graph, latitude is going from low to high. That means from from equator to pole. And we're looking at mammals, right? How many mammal species do we find? The number of species decreases from the tropics through the temperate regions to the poles, right? And we know that if we've watched nature videos. So there's a few hypotheses. Some combination of these is likely true. People love to try and figure out why this difference occurs. It seems obvious until you start trying to really demonstrate it. And so there's more sunlight energy at the tropics. There's more biomass at the tropics. Why does that mean there's more species? They have to diversify into more niches to avoid competition. The habitats are more complicated. We have these large trees, there's little trees, there's all this three-dimensional structure we don't see. So maybe there's just more niches in the tropical habitats. An interesting hypothesis is also if we look at the recent ice ages, where we had ice sheets coming down and covering large areas in temperate regions, we would have had extinctions of a lot of species that existed across those temperate regions, whereas we wouldn't have had those extinctions in the tropics. So biodiversity has kind of continued to increase in the tropics, whereas in the temperate and polar regions, there has sort of, they got squished, and then it hasn't had long enough to catch up again. So these are some of the kinds of ideas that people have about why this pattern is true. Another global pattern is that there's just some spots that have higher biodiversity compared to others, even within the same latitude. So even in the tropics, there's areas that are much more biodiverse than others, right? And conservation biologists have designated these hot spots, right? Find San Diego on our map here. Look, we are in a hot spot, right? So when I said we have an unusual number of species compared to other regions, it has been recognized globally, and that we are, like I said, incredibly fortunate. So one of the reasons that conservation biologists have designated these hotspots is that if we protect these hotspots, then we're protecting a lot of biodiversity, right? These are also great places to travel to. Wonderful places, the little arrows that are there for marine biodiversity hotspots, those are great areas to go snorkeling and scuba diving. And another thing about where we find different species, again, especially on islands, is that we're not only going to find high species richness sometimes, but what we're going to find are endemic species. So endemic species are ones that only live in a small geographic area. Often that's on an island. There's a species that only lives on Jamaica. There's a species that only lives on Dominica, right? So they have a small and restricted geographic range. We have a very famous endemic species here in San Diego, the Torrey pine. The Torrey pine only lives, well, it originally only lived, people have, propagated them and planted them all over the place, but they only existed in that little area in La Jolla and then out on one of the Channel Islands. So it's another example of an endemic species. They don't have to live on islands, but the vast majority of them do, right? So where we have a lot of endemic species, again, that little island or whatever, protecting that island is going to protect those unique species that we don't find anywhere else. Right, another pattern that we see has to do with disturbances and what kinds of habitats have disturbances, and why disturbance ends up making the overall biodiversity higher is a little complicated. Right, so the first thing we want to talk about is what is a disturbance, right? If nothing ever changes in the habitat and all of the sort of competitive dominant species are just keep on living and keep on outcompeting other species, then those competitive dominants are going to be the ones that we see when we look at that community. What a disturbance does is it kills them, or it removes a big chunk of them. So a disturbance is smaller than a catastrophe or an apocalypse, but it's big enough to remove a bunch of these dominant individuals from that community. If we're in a rocky intertidal zone, this could be an unusually large wave, all right? Maybe they caused a boulder to crash against a rock and it knocked off all the blue mussels that were living there. That's a disturbance on a scale of, those organisms are only about this big. So if we take out a patch of 100 of them, that's a disturbance. A disturbance might be here in San Diego. What do we have? We have fires, right? So the fire is going to burn through, it's going to burn down all those old stands of chamise and black sage, those other dry shrubs that have been just getting big and flammable. So there's human-caused disturbance too to habitats, but this ecological principle isn't really intended to talk about it. It's intended to talk about natural disturbance patterns. So these can be floods, weather events, not apocalyptic, once every 1,000 years, although those are disturbances too, but these are often things that happen regularly within any given habitat, right? So the species that live there actually have evolved over thousands of years to survive this particular kind of disturbance. So here in the San Diego region, we actually have plants that are adapted to fire. Some of them don't burn very much. Some of them, even if they get burnt, they just resprout again. Some of them have seeds that have to be burnt before they germinate. So they're going to wait until the area just gets wiped out with a fire before they even try to start to grow. All right, so those are disturbances, right? So you can imagine if there's never any disturbances, then you're going to have a lower biodiversity because only the most competitively dominant species are just going to take over. Won't give anybody else a chance, right? If you have too many disturbances and they're too large, right, you're just living in an apocalypse all the time and everybody's going to get killed. Nobody has a chance to recover. All right, there's a Goldilocks amount of disturbance that actually leads to the highest biodiversity, right? So this is called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which is a really fancy way of saying too little disturbance leads to low biodiversity, too much disturbance leads to low biodiversity, and intermediate or middle level of disturbance leads to higher biodiversity. So there's like a little upside down parabola shape here, all right? Part of the reason that disturbance leads to higher biodiversity has to do with when we look across a little bigger spatial scale than just looking at that one rock those mussels got wiped off of, right? So not just on that particular rock, but if we zoom out a little bit, what we're seeing is we have a little area that got disturbed, right? And then we have this other area over here that was disturbed a couple of years ago. And then we have another area that hasn't been disturbed for a long time. So that one that hasn't been disturbed for a long time is going to have that climax community on it. It's going to be covered in blue mussels. Nobody else can get their elbow in, right? But if we look at, there's going to be a difference between the patch on the rock that was disturbed last year versus the patch on the rock that was disturbed 3 years ago. And the reason for that is an ecological principle called succession. All right, Succession, like one thing after another, like one king dies and the next king succeeds them, right? Succession is a thing that happens predictably in a variety of different habitats. And so what happens is there's some species that are really well adapted to those disturbed habitats, right? They're going to grow really fast. They're going to take advantage of the open space, but they're not going to live that long. By the time they die, other species are starting to grow there, right? And as they grow and get bigger, then other species are sort of catching up, right? So when we have a forest, and we don't really have too many forests right here in San Diego, so this might be a harder example, but it was the classic way that this ecological pattern has always been explained, is we have these big trees that make up the forest, right? So what happens is when we have these big trees, they're shading all the ground below, and none of the other little plants have a chance to grow underneath them. But they take a long time to grow. So we have a forest fire, we have a hurricane, it kills all the trees. That brings us back. We start over again at the beginning of the succession. So then we have these plants that are going to come in and they're going to be able to grow and grow rapidly. And they're adapted for that really barren, denuded, disturbed habitat. Some seeds of those trees are starting to grow, but if you look at where these trees are, it takes them years to get big enough that they're shading everybody else out, right? So over that time frame, different species have a chance to grow, right? So when we have a landscape, a region, right, where we look across it and we have these patches that are at different places in this series of succession, right, we'll see that we have hardwood trees in one area that hasn't been disturbed for a long time. We'll have shrubs and softwood trees in another area that has been disturbed, but it was a while ago. And then when we see a freshly disturbed area, we'll have these annual plants. So instead of having this whole region with only one of these kinds of plants, we'll have a whole region that has all of these kinds of plants, because there's areas in a patchwork that are all at different times since that disturbance has happened. All right, so the sort of the simplest reason why disturbance, intermediate levels of disturbance increases diversity, is that it just changes the species that are able to live in that exact area. But when we combine it together with the idea of succession, we can see how over time we end up with a higher biodiversity across the region, because each of these patches is at a different place in their succession, right? So in this example, we're talking about a forest. There was a forest here already, right? So secondary succession is what happens when we've taken an existing habitat and we've reset it to the beginning. Primary succession is pretty interesting. It happens when we're in a habitat that has never had life on it before, right? It doesn't happen very often, but imagine a volcanic island is growing up out of the ocean, and it bubbles up in the lava, and it sort of eventually gets high enough that it doesn't get washed over by the ocean all the time, and it's just bare rock, right? Some little tuft of lichens and bacteria are going to land on that bit of rock, and they're actually going to start turning the rock into soil, right? And then after there's a little soil there, then some seeds can come in, some plants can start to grow. So primary succession is developing a biomass for the first time in a habitat. Secondary succession is sort of recovering biomass in an area that had it before. Right, our last example of factors that let us know how many species are in a particular area. And this one is called island biogeography, right? So biogeography is the study of the geographic distribution, or like where do we find different species. Island biogeography was actually derived mathematically by the scientists MacArthur and Wilson. So E.O. Wilson, who's actually now a sort of a famous writer and thinker about human interactions with the environment. He actually started out as an ant biologist, and he did this really, really pioneering work. So the idea is, when we look at an island, that there are some factors that are going to determine how many species there are on that island. And people noticed that the larger islands tended to have more species on them. Well, why is that? There's more area, right? So there's sort of physically more space, but why more species? Why not more individuals of one species? And so what they worked out was some mathematics that explained that there was a predictable relationship between a couple different factors. That if we know there's actually a constant or a sort of a calibrate the relationship, but we do tend to see this very predictable pattern. So what happens if we imagine an island having no species on it whatsoever to start with, the number of species that it can have is in part going to be determined by how many species there are on a mainland source or other islands that are near it. So where can species come to it from, right? If it's in the tropics, there will be more. If it's in temperate habitats, there will be less. So what's the species pool? And it turns out if we imagine we have the mainland over here, and then we have an island next to it, that if we just imagine there's sort of this constant but random rain falling of, you know, birds, lizards, whatever, spiders, insects, dust, seeds that blows off of the mainland and falls onto the island, that there's two really important factors in how many species we expect to see, right? One of them is pretty easy, that if we have an island that's closer to the mainland, we're going to have more species on it than if we have an island that's the same size, but it's further away, right? So closer, it just increases the probability that those species from the mainland are able to get there. If we have a small island compared to a large island, right? So if you're shooting at a dartboard, right? If the dartboard's bigger, it's easier to hit, right? So the island that's bigger is just randomly going to catch more of the species that are floating past, right? So we're going to have more species on bigger islands compared to small. We're going to have more species on closer islands compared to farther islands, right? So how species get there, the arrival of species, turns out to be important, but it actually turns out that species are also sort of maybe continuously arriving, but they also are continuously going extinct on that island, right? So they've colonized, they don't necessarily found a population. They may originally start a population, and then after a while it declines and it goes extinct. All right, why might that happen? Well, when it first gets to the island, it turns out it depends on how many species are there already, right? An island is easier for an invader to come into and invade if there's few competitors, right? So how many species are there already? If there's few, it's easier to colonize, and you're more likely to be able to survive. It turns out the size of the island is also important for that, right? So larger islands, it's going to be less likely species will go extinct. Small islands, it's more likely they'll go extinct. So the total number of species is actually an equilibrium. It's a balance between the numbers that are arriving and the numbers that are going extinct. And it turns out that they stay at equilibrium. So that also means that there's predicted that there's going to be some turnover, that when we look at that island, after some period of time, it may have about the same number of species, but they may be different species, right? So those are the fundamental principles of this idea called island biogeography. And it really changed people's thinking about ecological principles, especially that we could use mathematical equations to describe things that we would expect to see. Right, so these scientists first, they wrote a bunch of math, they made some predictions, then they actually went out and tested it. They did experiments on these tiny, tiny little islands off the Keys in Florida. And they demonstrated they could actually see this happening. All right, excuse me. All right, so all of these patterns we've talked about so far have happened in the past and they're continuing to happen today. Oh, one more thing about this island biogeography. It turns out that it works not only for islands of land in the middle of ocean, but all kinds of other island-like situations. The tops of mountains, for example, if they're high enough that they have a really different habitat than the surrounding landscape, it's as if they are islands, right? So an organism that can only live in that habitat, how does it get to the next mountain top, right? Most of the time they don't walk down the mountain and go to the other one. So it turns out that mountain tops or sky islands in Arizona and New Mexico also follow these same ideas. Ponds are the opposite, right? They're an island of water in the middle of terrestrial or unsuitable habitat. It turns out they follow these patterns as well. All right, so our last topic of this incredibly long lecture, I know you're exhausted, I'm exhausted too, we're getting there. Our last topic is extinction or biodiversity loss. And so we want to talk about some of the patterns of which kinds of species have gone extinct, how many, where, and then talk about why species go extinct. What are the causes of extinction? So here are some examples. The names of these organisms are on the next slide, but I gave pictures of them so you could imagine. So ranging from butterflies to, this is Stellar sea cow. It's kind of a gigantic sort of manatee-like thing. Some of these are in the US, others are global, the golden toad, the passenger pigeon, the Carolina parakeet in the United States. This one on the top left is called Tasmanian tiger or thylacine. And it's a marsupial predator and carnivore that was hunted to extinction in Tasmania, this little island state hanging off the bottom of Australia. And that was in the 1800s. So those are photos of the actual organism that's now extinct. Right. So here's an example from this, an interactive website that you can visit to look at different types of extinctions. So going back to 1996 is when the International Union was formed that monitors endangered and threatened species globally. But we know about a variety of extinctions going back to the 1500s from historical records. If we look at different regions, this dark region is actually the US. I think part of the reason that we have so many extinctions is that that we have documented them, that the history of a large number of dense human population along some of the areas of the country was somewhat more recent than in other areas. And so people were paying more attention. It's also possible that we just have cut a swath across the landscape at a faster rate than other countries, and it's just our bad. I don't know. But all the gray areas, there's no data, right? So this is very difficult to measure in areas that are more remote or in areas where we didn't know what species were there to begin with. Right? So this is only known species extinctions. There are likely hundreds, if not thousands more of areas of habitat that were destroyed, especially of things like insects that are smaller and less easy to notice, that are extinct that we never even knew existed. All right. So our examples on the last picture are shown different locations around the globe. So we have extinctions being happening everywhere, basically. All right, so when we talk about a species going extinct, that means that every single individual of that species is dead. Some species we now have, they're extinct in the wild, and there is a captive population of them in zoos. For example, California condor was extinct in the wild. There were a very small number of individuals left. They were brought into captivity and have been a part of an intensive captive breeding program for decades. They've finally been re-released into the wild. They're still monitored and managed quite aggressively. And they were literally saved from extinction by human intervention. Extinction is almost inevitable after a population gets to a small enough size, right? So we might think, oh, there's enough left that they should be okay. It turns out in some cases they're not at all, and they can go from a fairly large size to extinct relatively rapidly. That happened with passenger pigeons in the United States. It turned out they needed a large number of individuals at each nesting colony in order to survive the predation that happened to them. When they got below a certain level, the predators were able to wipe them out in a generation or two. All right, so what is this small size that a population, if it gets below? We have a value. Sorry about that. An estimate, we can, if we have enough data on a population, we can estimate it. Now it isn't 100%, but we call this number the MVP, right? Not because it's great. It's the minimum viable population. Depending on the biology of the organism, this could be a large number in the thousands. It could be as small as 50 to 100. But once the population gets below that minimum viable size, so viability has to do with survival. What's the smallest size this population could get before it's basically doomed to extinction? That's what that number is setting. Right? How do we know it's doomed once it gets that small? Because something happens when a population gets small, and that is that it tends to get even smaller. All right, so this idea that's shown on this slide is called the extinction vortex. Right, a vortex is like the swirl of water that goes down your toilet. Once a population gets small, things happen to it that make it even smaller. Right, so a small population is going to get even smaller. So the things that are going to happen to it are things that we've already talked about, right? That are going to cause changes to its fitness, right? So remember that the ability to survive and reproduce is relative to other individuals is fitness. The better you are at surviving and reproducing, the more likely you are to leave offspring, right? What happens when we have a small population? We probably went through a population bottleneck, right? So we have a small amount of genetic variation. So when we have a small population, we have closely related individuals breeding with each other. That's called inbreeding. And that tends to switch the population from having lots of heterozygotes to having lots of homozygotes, which is less genetic diversity. We tend to have genetic drift happen, which is not the nice natural selection adaptation kind of genetic changes, but just random genetic changes because only a few individuals are surviving. Both of those things lead to a loss of genetic variability. Lower genetic variability reduces the ability of that population to adapt to changes in the environment. It's going to be probably less fit than the larger population was, just because you get this accumulation of bad alleles. Once the population has lower genetic diversity, it's probably less well adapted. That means it's going to have lower reproduction and higher mortality. If you have low reproduction and high mortality, your population will not grow, right? Fewer offspring, more will die. You have a smaller population, right? So these changes in genetic diversity lead to reduction in fitness, which leads to further reduction in population size. Now, these things add to one another. So this set of circumstances where we have some characteristic that causes that characteristic to be emphasized is called a positive feedback loop. Right? Positive here is not meaning it's great, it's good. Positive is meaning that thing happened and it actually leads to changes that cause more of it to happen, right? So there are some good positive feedback loops. If you never exercise and you start exercising a little bit, you feel so much better that you exercise more. That's a positive feedback loop, right? That's a good thing. This one's a negative one. You have a small population, it makes things happen that tend to make the population even smaller, right? Other things like you're running late and you do something stupid, like you leave your wallet at home and then you have to go back and get it, and then you get even later, right? Positive feedback loop. Negative feedback loops, on the other hand, we're going to talk about them for weeks when we talk about physiology. Negative feedback loops are the way that our bodies stay at homeostasis. So we exercise, our temperature gets a little bit higher, we start to sweat, that cools us off and brings our temperature down, right? So instead of pushing us, if we sweated and we got hot, even hotter, that would be a positive feedback loop, but we don't do that, right? We would die. So negative feedback loops are really, really important in biology. There aren't very many examples of positive feedback loops. We'll talk about a couple, but they're very rare because we want to keep our bodies at the same state, right, that we're alive at. So we have all these negative feedback loops that if we change from a particular variable, it pushes us back to where we started from, which is where we want to be. All right. So once a population size gets too small, it sort of inevitably goes extinct. How small is too small? We can calculate an estimate of that. Why does it get small in the first place? All right, why does a population get small in the first place? That's what we're going to talk about in our last section. All right, so our causes of extinction, we can put them into four categories: habitat loss, introduced species, pollution, and overharvest. So we'll go through a little more detail for each one of these things, but I want to start with giving you a definition and then show you some examples. When I start talking about extinction, I get really sad. The acronym or word to remember these four causes of extinction: habitat loss, introduced species, pollution, and overharvest is HIPPO. And I like to watch this silly video to make me feel less sad after talking about extinction. So I put the link in for it. Hopefully it works. All right, habitat loss is when basically humans have taken over the habitat and the organisms that used to live there have lost it, right? So when we, for human use, we destroy or degrade natural habitat, it is lost to the species that were trying to live there before us. Right? So we've taken it over. This ranges from, yes, we've bulldozed huge areas in San Diego and poured concrete on them. That is lost habitat. But habitat can be lost to species. For example, there's a little canyon behind my house, but people's cats go down there. So there's native bird species that don't live there anymore, right? So just because we're not sitting on it doesn't mean that maybe we've dug up the native plants and we've put in landscaping plants, but we've changed the habitat in other ways that make it less useful for the species that normally would live there. Introduced species are species that came from somewhere else, right? Humans have a history of doing this on purpose and also accidentally doing it. So it isn't necessarily a problem we move a species from one place to another, but what happens is we take it out of its community. Back home in its community, it had competitors, it had predators, it had diseases. And so it was fine. It was a normal and good member of its community. But when we move it into a new environment, often what happens is it has no predators, it has no diseases, it has no competitors. And so it can increase rapidly and dramatically, and it can take over the habitat, it can outcompete native species. And so just because a species doesn't live somewhere doesn't mean that it can't live there if we move it. So an example is the, well, we'll talk about some examples in person. So just because a species is introduced doesn't necessarily mean it wreaks havoc on the environment. So we often talk about invasive species, right? Ones that have invaded and then did a bunch of bad stuff. Sometimes these are predators, and they, you know, the species in the new environment don't have any protection against them. Sometimes these are plants that really take over the environment. A lot of them are diseases, right? So we see introduced plant diseases that have ravaged entire ecosystems. Excuse me. Pollution is where humans have introduced enough of some kind of chemical into the environment that it has changed the properties of the environment, whether it's a chemical that's out and out toxic, or if it's like introducing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, has caused other changes. Finally, overharvest or overexploitation. This isn't necessarily a species that we harvest for food, but that we may have killed or captured or collected for their feathers or for their fur or for any other reason, or just killed them because we don't like them. All right, so when we think about habitat loss, this picture of Mission Valley from 1950 always just amazes me. That as long ago, I wasn't born then, but my parents were alive, that Mission Valley was fields, there were cows there. And then obviously if you've driven through Mission Valley lately, there's the river still there, but you can barely find it. We've covered the area with roads and parking lots and whatever. So this is an example of habitat loss. Any birds or plants or bugs or whatever that were living there before probably aren't, right? Some examples of invasive species, like I was saying, some diseases like this fungal disease, sudden oak death, may not sound that exciting, but these plant diseases that have been introduced have caused huge changes across ecosystems worldwide. The damage, the economic cost of introduced invasive species is in the billions of dollars a year just in the US. These range from damage to fisheries, because things like this European green crab are introduced and are wiping out all of the clams that are being harvested. Plants like this giant reed that just take over in watersheds. Crop damage, this bug at the top, this glassy sharpshooter. It's a pest on citrus, I think. And then sometimes they're just annoying. This ant on the left is an Argentine ant. It's from Argentina. They're not native to California. These are the ones that you're most likely to see in your house, in your yard, really irritating. They're small compared to our native ants, and where they have displaced the native ant species by competition, predators on the native ant species like horned lizards have less food, right? So they have not directly impacted the horned lizard, but they have indirectly impacted it, right? Argentine ant is a really interesting story. The reason that they're kept in check in population number in their home country is that they live in colonies, and the family groups fight. They wage war against other non-family groups that live nearby. So they're actually, it's an intraspecific aggressive interaction that they kill one another, they keep the population numbers fairly small. So this is a great example of genetic drift. And that is a very small number of individuals of the Argentine ant were originally introduced into the US in Texas, I believe. They're all closely related to one another. So as they spread and they increased in population size across the United States, they didn't form these family groups that were competing with one another, and that form of mortality is non-existent in this country. So they've continued to spread and expand, and it's because they're too genetically similar to one another as individuals, and they don't have the same behavior as they had in their home country. Right, so lots of really interesting relationship between these invasive species and their evolution and their genetics. Most were introduced from a small population, so so they can be really interesting examples of genetic drift. All right, overexploitation or overharvest is one of the easiest ones to understand. Basically, we have killed a variety of animals, mostly faster than they can reproduce. And we have seen dramatic decreases in populations of large animals, pandas, elephants, you name it, all those examples that we see. A lot of zoo animals that we see are have been reduced by orders of magnitude from their original populations. All right, pollution is the last one we're going to talk about it because it gets pretty complicated. Pollution, we sort of started thinking about pollution as putting toxic chemicals into the environment. Now, when we first started making these toxic chemicals industrially in the United States and around the world, people weren't dumping them in large amounts into the environment. And so it didn't seem like they would have a very big negative effect, right? So yeah, some was spilled, like we had oil spills, but it seems like a fairly small amount when you look at how big the ocean is. It turns out that a couple kinds of chemicals or molecules with particular characteristics end up becoming extremely harmful. And there's two characteristics that are important about these chemicals. If you dumped a big vat of vitamin C into the environment, it wouldn't cause harm because organisms take it up and they pee it out, right? So vitamin C is water soluble, right? But the kinds of chemicals that become a problem in the environment are not water soluble, they're fat soluble. So they're lipophilic. They tend to be oily, right? Think about oil. And there's a whole wide variety of chemicals that are used in different applications, things like pesticides, things like, this example is PCBs or polychloral biphenyls, which are used in electrical products and some industrial applications. That these molecules, because they're lipophilic, when an organism takes them in, they don't get washed out of the body with the urine or diffuse out. They stay, they stick, they dissolve into any fats that are stored in the body, and they stay there. All right, so even though we're not absorbing that much of these chemicals in the water, right, so the concentration in the water is very, very low. It's almost undetectable. But where we have an organism that is consuming some of that molecule from the water, all of it that accumulated over its entire lifetime gets stored, right? So then it's eaten by another organism. So where we have the food chain and we have a lifetime accumulation of a phytoplankton's PCB dose, it's getting eaten by a zooplankton, and then the lifetime accumulation of PCBs of a zooplankton is getting eaten by a smelt, and so on and so forth. By the time we get up to those top trophic level predators, there's a high enough concentration in their tissues of their body that it's causing negative health consequences. All right, so we may see cancers, we may see other kinds of liver damage, depending on the chemical. There's all kinds of weird things with these, but the PCBs and DDT that were most common in the environment in the late 1960s, early 70s and 80s cause reproductive harm. So we saw in mostly birds of prey, pelicans, osprey, peregrine falcons, bald eagles. We saw this almost total reproductive failure. And that was from DDT, not PCB, but it works the same way. So this phenomenon is called bioaccumulation. And the idea of it is the further you go up the food chain, the higher the concentration or the accumulation of these toxic molecules. They can start out not at high concentrations in the water, but they end up at high concentrations in the tissues. Fortunately, in the United States, we banned DDT. We banned a lot of these molecules in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act were landmark pieces of legislation. The other thing about these molecules, though, is that they're persistent. Persistent meaning that once they get in the environment, they stay. They don't get degraded or broken down. The reason they're persistent is because they're synthetic molecules. We invented them, chemists invented them, we create them in a laboratory, so they're not naturally occurring. If we dump something that's naturally occurring out into the world, there's bacteria, there's organisms that are going to break it down. They have to have a chemical reaction that's able to break apart those molecules. But there is no natural organism that breaks down DDT, right? So no matter how long we leave a pile of it sitting there, it's just going to sit there. So they aren't going away. So we haven't been putting more in. A lot of some areas have been cleaned up, but they still persist, and they're actually even in the bodies of humans at this point. So that's kind of the traditional approach to what pollution is and why we care about it. All right, now since the 1970s into the 80s and today, we are much more worried about pollution of atmospheric molecules and differences in those molecules. So starting in about 1970, scientists in Antarctica noticed that our ozone layer that protects us from UV radiation was starting to get thin, especially seasonally over Antarctica. And chemists figured out that these chlorofluorocarbon or CFC molecules that we have been using as refrigerants in air conditioners and freezers and refrigerators were getting released accidentally into the atmosphere, floating up into the stratosphere, and they catalyze the breakdown of ozone molecules into oxygen molecules. So this reduction in ozone, unfortunately, every molecule of CFC, because it's a catalyst, it can keep destroying ozone over and over again. All right, in a miracle of efficiency, the world got together, and by 1989, signed an agreement called the Montreal Protocol and banned CFC molecules. So we've more or less, the Western world, some places are still using them, but it's decreased almost to zero, the use of those molecules. And gradually we're seeing the ozone hole or the lack of ozone decreasing. About 2003, it started to turn around, and it's projected to sort of be back to where it was by 2050 or so. So I like to talk about this example because it's a major global change to the atmosphere that humans caused, and we got together and we fixed it. Now it's taken a long time, but at the time, you know, people were saying, "Oh no, it's too expensive, we can't do it," right? And then we did, and now we're fixing the problem. So when we look at climate change today, it can feel really sad and overwhelming, but I like to keep returning to the idea that we actually have in, you know, living human history, been able to solve a problem of similar magnitude. So I have hope. All right. So our last topic is looking at global carbon dioxide concentrations. We will come back to talking about global warming more in a couple of lectures. So if all of your questions aren't answered by this brief discussion, we'll talk about it more. So humans have been excavating fossil fuels and burning them, which puts carbon dioxides into the atmosphere. And scientists, even as early as the early 1900s, were thinking, well, wait a sec, isn't putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere increasing the amount of greenhouse gases? I wonder if we're putting enough into the atmosphere that we could detect it, right? So one scientist from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, Keeling, he started measuring it. And his son is now also an atmospheric scientist who has continued doing this work and is also at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, right up the hill from us, right? So yes, indeed, carbon dioxide concentrations are measurably increasing in the atmosphere. We think about where carbon dioxide comes from and where it goes in our atmosphere in the Northern Hemisphere. In the winter, vast forests of North America and Northern Europe and Central Asia are asleep. They're not doing photosynthesis. So the carbon dioxide concentration gradually rises when those vast forests wake up in the spring and summer and are doing photosynthesis. They're pulling the carbon dioxide back in. And so the amount of difference between all the plants being asleep versus all the plants being active are these little up and down zigzags every year, right? So these little up and down zigzags are maybe 5 parts per million. But we notice over this period of time that indeed there's been a gradual increase, right? Average global temperature, it wiggles around a lot. We have weather, we have variability, but in general, it's been increasing too. Again, we'll come back to this when we talk about the Earth in a couple lectures, but notice the difference in scale on the left-hand side. So we've got carbon dioxide concentration for the blue lines, about 310 to over 380 parts per million. Global temperature on the right. So we've gone about a degree when we go across this 50-year period on the graph. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but we know that the Earth's temperature on average differed between glacial periods and interglacial periods of about 5 to 10 degrees C. So 1 degree C doesn't seem like that much, and it's hard to imagine how we can measure it across the whole planet. But 1 degree C, when you're thinking we could have the difference between an ice age versus a non-ice age with 10 degrees C, it actually is quite a bit, right? How much carbon dioxide have we been putting into the atmosphere? Well, it's billions of tons. And since the Industrial Revolution in the early 1900s, it really started to escalate after World War II. Current contributions are spread around the globe and are changing a little bit over time. The United States has been a major contributor, a single country contributor. China has surpassed us. But if we look at some of these lines, although the overall total is increasing, that we see some regions like Europe, that the total amount of emissions has been started to decline and is declining. Part of the reason for the decline is slightly declining population size. Other areas, the population size is increasing. Other areas, the standard of living is going up too, right? So they're going to be using more energy and burning more fossil fuels as standard of living goes up, right? Which is a good thing. We don't want people globally living in poverty, not having access to medical care, to the comfort of having heating and air conditioning, et cetera. All right, so the US is a major player in contributing to global climate change. And if we look at how much total, we're responsible for about 1/4 of the total emissions so far. Right? So we do have a responsibility, in my opinion, to do a lot in terms of helping to reduce that. We'll talk about this more in our live discussion. All right, so what else are we doing that has an impact on carbon dioxide? Well, when we think about those plants, those trees that can be taking up carbon dioxide, right? They take it up, they store it in their bodies. And so not only do they use it, but they remove it from the atmosphere. So where we have large standing forests, not only they're storing carbons, and they're also actively removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This can't solve the whole problem, right? Remember how little those wiggles were up and down on the graph, but certainly a major way that has contributed to increases in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a decrease in forest cover, right? Deforestation is the removal of forests, and we have been busily deforesting all over the planet since humans have existed. All right. So here's the world, and it's a little hard to see these patterns, but this is original kind of, I don't know, 1,000, like maybe before human populations started having a very big impact on the environment a long time ago. And 2005, I think the easiest place to look to see these differences is sub-Saharan Africa. We see this big equatorial forest and how much it's shrunk in the 2005, and it's still decreasing. So that was 15 years ago, and it's still happening. If we zoom in on, say, one location where we can look at the map a little better, this is Borneo, one of the islands in Indonesia, and it was almost totally forested in 1950. By 2020, its original forest area has decreased, I don't know, visually, maybe it's less than half, maybe down to a third. The other thing to notice about how deforestation occurs is that not only does the total area decrease, but we see that there's, sorry, it doesn't stay solid, that we have these little patches that are left across different places. So not only are we causing habitat loss, we're causing habitat fragmentation, which is that we're splitting it up into little bits, which are not as good as the original. All right, so this vast amount of forest that has been reduced is also contributing to the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So as we're talking about strategies to mitigate climate change, not only is reducing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions important, but also reforesting, because that will help us achieve carbon neutrality. All right, so what are the consequences of global climate change? We'll come back and talk a little more about changes to organisms, but what the most obvious, biggest difference is going to be little increase in temperature is going to cause melting of the polar ice caps and glaciers and sea ice. When all of that water that was then held in those water reserves melts, it's going to cause an increase in sea level. All right, so how big of an impact is an increase in sea level going to have? Here is a map I found of Mission Beach and projected 2050 high tide range shown in purple. Right, so when we go out to the ocean and we see the water going up and down every day, it's hard for us to say what is the tide level, right? Highest high tide of the year is one way to measure it. And this model predicts that by 2050, most of Mission Beach, there will be times of the year that it will be flooding. So don't buy a house down there. And as we're talking about other impacts of climate change, when we look at our own very own human infrastructure, that there are going to start being some pretty inconvenient changes in our, especially our low-lying coastal cities and communities. And when we look around at the globe, that some of the areas that are most low-lying, for example, islands in the Pacific, Oceania, they may be the most impacted by sea level rise, and yet they have been one of the smallest contributors of it. So there's a lot to unpack and think about in talking about global climate change, but this has been a very quick summary of some of the science, and we'll talk about it more. I'll answer all your questions when we meet in person.